He sat outside again that night, shoulders hunched against the cold, a cigarette burning slowly between his fingers. I watched him through the bedroom window, just as I had done every night for the past month. He sat silently, his face marked with age and quiet sorrow, always in the same chair, beneath the same patch of sky. The chill in the air was sharp. It was midwinter, after all, but that didn't stop him. Wrapped in nothing but a thin shawl, he smoked one cigarette after another, like a man trying to burn away something deeper than the night's frost. I had been living in my aunt and uncle's house for almost a month, searching for work in a new city. And in that time, I had never once seen my uncle sleep in his own bedroom. Every night, without fail, he would leave and sit just outside his door until morning. I found it odd, disturbing even. Why would anyone choose the freezing silence of the veranda over the warmth of their bed? The answer came to me by accident. It was just after sunset. I was heading to their room to ask my aunt if she could make me a cup of tea when I paused outside their door. Loud voices erupted from within. My hand froze midair, inches from knocking. "I've told you 100 times," my aunt shouted, her voice sharp and laced with fury. "Don't come into this room again. I can't even stand the sight of you." Then came my uncle's calm voice, low and steady. "I only came to get my clothes, that's all. I'll leave." I stepped back quickly, heart pounding. Moments later, the door opened and my uncle stepped out. He didn't notice me hiding behind the curtain. His face looked older, wearier than ever before as he quietly closed the door and walked to his usual spot, his sanctuary in the cold. That night, something shifted in me. I understood why he never stayed in the room. He wasn't choosing the cold, he was being pushed into it. And the one doing the pushing was my aunt. As I returned to my bed and pulled the blanket over me, sleep didn't come. Questions stirred restlessly in my mind. Had their relationship always been like this? Their marriage was nearing 2 years now, but I'd only been here for a month. Was this distance between them recent? Or had it always existed? I didn't have the answers, but I knew one thing for certain. The look in his eyes, the silence in his shoulders, it wasn't just cold he was trying to endure. It was something far more painful. The next morning, I woke to the shrill ringtone of my phone. It was my mother calling. Rubbing my eyes, I answered, trying to shake off the restlessness from the night before. She asked how I was doing, whether I was eating well, and if everything was all right at my aunt's place. I answered half-heartedly. "Everything's fine. My aunt and uncle are both doing well," I lied. She continued chatting, her voice soft with motherly concern. But my thoughts drifted back to the night before, to the argument I'd overheard and the sadness in my uncle's eyes. Before I could stop myself, I asked, "Did Aunt Maria choose her husband, or was it an arranged marriage?" There was a pause on the other end. Then my mother asked, surprised, "Why are you asking this all of a sudden?" "No reason," I replied quickly. "I was just wondering. Uncle seems much older than her." My mother sighed, the kind of sigh that always came before a long story. "Your aunt was the one who insisted on marrying him. It wasn't arranged. In fact, your grandfather was completely against it. He tried everything to stop it, but Maria wouldn't listen. She fought with him, cried, begged, and eventually your grandfather gave in, but not without consequences. He told her to never return to his house again." I blinked, stunned. "So it was a love marriage?" "Yes," she confirmed. "And not just that. Maria was his favorite. He loved her more than any of us. When she made that choice, it broke him. After the wedding, she never came back home." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I had assumed, given the way she treated her husband, that perhaps she had been forced into the marriage, that the age gap had bred resentment. But according to my mother, she had chosen this life. After the call ended, I sat quietly, trying to make sense of it all. If she had loved him once, what had changed? Had time drained that love away, or had something darker happened in the shadows of their marriage? I wanted to ask her, but something about her sharp tongue and distant manner made it difficult. Still, the mystery clawed at my thoughts. I couldn't shake the image of her face, cold and distant, whenever his name was mentioned. And I couldn't forget the way he looked at her when she wasn't watching, like someone waiting for the sun to rise in a sky that no longer held light. I had come to this house looking for work, but now I found myself searching for something else entirely. The truth behind the silence between them. Days passed, but the weight of that conversation with my mother lingered. My aunt's behavior confused me more than ever. She was never cruel to me. On the contrary, she treated me with kindness, cooked for me, and smiled often. But when it came to her husband, something changed in her completely. Her voice turned cold, her face unreadable, like a door slammed shut from the inside. I started paying more attention to her. In the kitchen, she moved efficiently, humming under her breath as though nothing were wrong in her world. One morning, I walked in and she looked up with a bright smile. "Oh, good, you're awake," she said. "I made your favorite breakfast." I smiled, touched by the gesture. She pointed toward the eggs sizzling on the pan and said, "You must eat well, especially when you're job hunting. I know it's not easy." "You're so kind to me," I said sincerely. "It never feels like I'm away from home." She looked pleased. Then I decided to test the waters. "Do you cook like this for Uncle too?" I asked, feigning casual curiosity. The smile on her face vanished. Her hand, holding the spatula, paused midair. "He makes his own breakfast," she replied without looking at me. "He doesn't like the way I cook." She quickly changed the subject, but I had already seen the truth flash across her face. Discomfort and something deeper, like irritation buried beneath years of silence. Later that evening, we sat together at dinner. My uncle quietly announced that he had been transferred to another city for work. He would be leaving for 6 months. He barely lifted his gaze from the plate while he spoke. What shocked me wasn't his announcement, but my aunt's reaction. She smiled. Not the polite kind of smile, but one that reached her eyes. "Then we'll need to pack your things quickly," she said eagerly. "You can't afford to leave anything behind." Before he could respond, she left the table, already halfway to their bedroom, muttering something about suitcases. I looked at him. He didn't move, didn't speak. His eyes glistened with unshed tears. In that moment, he looked smaller, older, and heartbreakingly tired. He wasn't just leaving the house, he was being let go. That night, he left quietly with a small suitcase and a bowed head. She waved goodbye from the doorway, not with sorrow, but with satisfaction. And I sat at the dinner table staring at her, realizing something terrifying. Somewhere along the way, love had curdled into bitterness, and she didn't miss him. Not even a little. After my uncle left, the house felt noticeably lighter, but not in the way peace descends after a long war. It was a strange kind of silence. My aunt, now visibly cheerful, filled the space with humming, tidying, and cooking elaborate meals. She seemed renewed, but for me, the atmosphere had become heavier. That night, I went to bed early. The day had been exhausting. I had walked across the city attending interviews, none of which had brought any hope. I closed my eyes, trying to sleep, when suddenly there was a knock on the door. It was nearly 1 a.m. I sat up, confused. Who could it be at this hour? I opened the door and froze. There she stood, my aunt, wearing something I couldn't have imagined, a silk nightdress that shimmered in the dim light. Her hair was open and there was an unnatural calm on her face. "Aren't you going to let me in?" she asked softly. I couldn't speak. I simply stepped back as she walked in on her own and sat comfortably on the edge of my bed, one leg crossed over the other. Her eyes didn't leave me. "I couldn't sleep," she said. "I'm not used to the silence. Your uncle's gone and I thought maybe we could talk." There was something about her tone, light but layered with something far deeper. I stood awkwardly across the room, unsure how to respond. "I'm sorry, Aunt. I have an early interview tomorrow," I muttered, avoiding her eyes. "I should probably sleep." She smiled at me, her eyes searching my face. "You're a good boy," she said, "worried about your future. Your mother must be proud. You think about others so much." Her voice trembled slightly. "No one ever asked me what I wanted." There was sadness in her words, but the closeness of her presence made it hard to focus. I shifted uncomfortably as she leaned forward and placed her hand on mine. "Sometimes I think maybe if I had met someone like you earlier, my life would have been different." I pulled my hand away gently and stood up. I I really should sleep. You should rest too." She watched me quietly for a moment, then stood without protest. "Good night," she whispered, and walked out, her perfume lingering in the air. I locked the door behind her, heart racing. Sleep didn't come that night, only questions and a rising fear I didn't yet understand. The next morning, sunlight crept through the curtains, but I remained in bed longer than usual. My thoughts were clouded, replaying the events of the night before. I had always respected my aunt, a woman who carried herself with grace and strength. But now that perception felt blurred. Her presence in my room, her words, her nearness, they had unsettled something inside me. And yet, more than anything, it was her loneliness that echoed most. Before I could gather myself, my phone rang. It was my mother again. I hesitated for a moment before answering, unsure whether to share what had happened. "How's your job search going?" she asked, her voice hopeful. "Still nothing," I replied, my voice dull. "But I'm trying." She continued with small talk, telling me that a proposal had come from my youngest sister. Good family, decent people. She sounded happy, hopeful in a way I hadn't felt in days. Then came her gentle reminder. "Once you get a job, try to stay at your aunt's place. Don't shift to a hostel. It'll save money. And she's alone. She won't feel so lonely." I wanted to tell her everything, that it wasn't my aunt's loneliness I feared. It was what it was doing to her. But I remained quiet. She continued, "She's a kind woman, and having someone at home helps her too. You know your uncle's away. You're a good boy. I trust you." Her trust felt like a burden on my shoulders. After the call, I left the house early, wandering the city in search of work. I dropped off resumes, waited in reception areas, endured interviews I knew wouldn't lead anywhere. The world outside was indifferent, but it was easier to bear than the questions that waited for me at home. By dusk, I was still jobless and dreading the return. When I stepped inside the house that night, my aunt was waiting for me by the door. She looked worried. "I was getting anxious," she said. "You were gone all day." I forced a smile. "Just busy, job hunting." She reached out, gently touched my shoulder. "Don't lose hope. Something will come along if you need anything. Even money. Just ask. I'm here." I nodded, thanked her quietly, and retreated to my room. But a few minutes later, she followed. This time, she brought food, on a tray, and wore a black nightgown that clung too tightly to her figure. I turned my face away immediately. "Please, don't come in like this," I said, trying to stay calm. But she didn't leave. Instead, she sat beside me again and whispered, "Do you have any idea how suffocating this house is when you're not around?" Her voice trembled, but her gaze held mine. "You don't know what it feels like to live in this house, day after day, trapped in a life you never asked for. Everyone believes I chose this marriage. They think I defied my family for love, but they don't know what really happened. You don't know." I remained still, uncertain whether to speak or to listen. She wiped her eyes and continued, "It wasn't a love story. It was a trap. I was in college when it happened. A car pulled up beside me, and before I could react, someone grabbed me. They dragged me into the vehicle and drove off. I screamed. I fought, but no one came. I leaned in slightly, heart sinking. They drugged me," she said. "And when I woke up, I was in a locked room. There he was, your uncle. He was smiling, acting like he had rescued me from the world. He told me he loved me, that he had been watching me for months. And then, without my consent, he married me. A fake ceremony, forced vows, and then..." She paused, unable to say it out loud, but I understood. My hands clenched unconsciously. I begged him to let me go. Instead, he told me to convince my father to accept the marriage, and if I didn't, he'd harm my family. I felt like the air had been punched from my chest. All this time, I thought she was heartless, cruel. But now I saw the scars she had been hiding. I couldn't tell anyone. I was terrified. I went home and fought my father. He never forgave me. I was disowned. Everyone believed I had betrayed them for love. No one knew I was trying to survive. She looked away, her voice quieter now. I married my kidnapper, lived with him, slept beside him, and no one ever knew what it cost me. Silence filled the room, but it wasn't the same as before. It was heavier, darker. Over the years, he changed, she said. He left the wrong path, started a business, tried to be kind. But it was too late. Every time I looked at him, I saw the man who destroyed my life. She looked back at me then, tears streaming down her cheeks. And now you remind me of the life I was supposed to have. Someone gentle. Someone who would have loved me without stealing my soul. I didn't know what to say. My heart ached, not just for her, but for every woman silenced by fear, misjudged by others. I'm sorry, I whispered. I didn't know. She smiled through her tears. No one ever does. She sat beside me, no longer proud, no longer composed, just a woman unraveling under the weight of her truth. I had never seen anyone so broken yet so composed, as if her entire life had been held together by silence, and now that silence had finally cracked open. I lived like a shadow in this house, she said. Your uncle tried, I know. After a few years, he gave up everything, his old ways, his dealings, even his friends. He became someone new. He started treating me with care. But it didn't matter, because the man he used to be, he still lived inside my memories. I nodded slowly. I remembered how tenderly my uncle had cared for her during her illness, how he had stayed awake all night, making soup, checking her temperature, pressing cold cloths against her forehead. I had seen it in his eyes. Genuine love. But I also now understood why that love was never returned. I can't forget, she whispered. When he touches me, I don't feel warmth. I feel helpless. Like I did the day he locked me in that room. Her voice trembled again. And when your grandfather died, it was like the last piece of me collapsed. He had taken me in as a daughter, loved me like his own, and I ruined his trust. I wasn't even his biological child, and yet he gave me his name, his home, his pride. And she stopped herself, eyes brimming with tears. I gave him shame. You didn't give him shame, I said gently. You were a victim. You were silenced. She looked up at me, surprised by the kindness in my voice. I used to think you hated your husband for no reason, I admitted. I thought you were cruel, but now I see you've been carrying a wound no one even bothered to look at. She reached for my hand, her touch warm but hesitant. Do you think I'm beyond healing? I hesitated, then shook my head. No, but maybe it's time to stop living in the shadow of the past. Your uncle, he made a mistake, a terrible one, but he's not the same man anymore. He's changed. Maybe he doesn't deserve your love, but maybe you deserve peace. Her lips parted slightly as if she hadn't considered that peace could be hers. You don't have to love him again, I continued. But maybe forgiveness will free you more than punishment ever could. She looked at me for a long moment, then nodded slowly. I'll try, she whispered. For the first time since I arrived in this house, I saw something in her eyes that wasn't bitterness or blame. It was the beginning of healing. The days that followed felt lighter, not because anything drastic had changed, but because something invisible had shifted. My aunt smiled more often, not the rehearsed kind she wore for guests or neighbors, but one that reached her eyes, quiet, hesitant, and real. She began spending more time in the living room, reading by the window, watching the street below as if rediscovering a world she had long forgotten. And though she still kept to herself, she no longer flinched at the mention of her husband's name. That, in itself, felt like a victory. Then one morning, as I was leaving for an interview, she stopped me at the door. When you return, she said, stay for dinner. I'm making your uncle's favorite dish. I paused, trying not to show my surprise. He's visiting? She gave a shy nod. I called him yesterday. I was stunned into silence. She looked down at her hands. I told him I wanted to talk, that maybe it was time. I smiled and left without saying more, giving her space to make her own path forward. That evening, when I returned, I found my uncle sitting at the dining table, his hands folded, his eyes moist. My aunt stood in the kitchen, her movements quiet and steady. I stepped aside, not wanting to intrude, but I overheard him. "I never thought I'd hear your voice again," he said, barely audible. She didn't reply at first. Then softly, "I'm not saying everything's okay, but I want to try." He nodded, wiping his face with the edge of his sleeve. "That's more than I ever hoped for." They sat across from each other, not touching, not smiling, but present. That night, there were no arguments, no tears, just a quiet dinner served with gentle hands and eyes that dared to meet again. The past wasn't gone, it would never be, but something new had been planted, a fragile seed of reconciliation. Later, as I sat on the rooftop under the stars, I realized something profound. Healing doesn't come in grand moments or dramatic gestures. It comes in silence, broken by a few brave words. It comes when truth is no longer buried, when pain is named, and when forgiveness isn't demanded but offered. My aunt had lived for years behind walls she never built, and now, slowly, she was learning to open a window. I didn't know what their future would look like, but I knew one thing. It wouldn't be as cold as their past. In the weeks that followed, the house felt transformed, not by decorations or renovations, but by something intangible. The bitterness in the air had faded, replaced with a quiet calm. My aunt no longer avoided rooms where my uncle had sat. She no longer closed her door sharply at night. And though they weren't suddenly a picture-perfect couple, something in their rhythm had softened. I stayed silent, letting their moments rebuild themselves without interference. But I could see the small changes. The way she placed an extra spoon for him at the table, the way he returned home earlier than before. They weren't grand gestures, but they were real. Then came the moment I had long prepared for. I was offered a job. It wasn't ideal, and it didn't pay much, but it was enough to stand on my own feet. I was ready to move into a hostel, give them space, and start fresh. That evening, I sat with my aunt in the kitchen and told her the news. She didn't smile. "You're not going anywhere," she said firmly, placing a hand on my arm. "This house, this life. We owe it to you. I was caught off guard. You don't owe me anything, Aunt." Tears filled her eyes. "You don't understand. If you hadn't been here, if you hadn't listened that night, I don't know what would have become of me. I was slipping into something dangerous. You reminded me I wasn't dead inside." I was quiet. She continued. "You gave me the courage to confront what I had buried for years. And your uncle, he needed that too. We needed someone to remind us of what we still had." I tried to protest, but she shook her head. "Stay. This is your home too." A few months later, something happened none of us expected. My aunt was pregnant. At first, she didn't believe it. After years of emptiness, after seasons of heartbreak, life had returned in the form of a tiny heartbeat. I saw my uncle cry for the first time as he held the sonogram report in his trembling hands. She stood beside him, no longer distant, but joined to him by more than just paper or past, but by a future. And when their son was born, I held the child in my arms, realizing I had witnessed something rare. A broken love mended by truth. A scarred heart healed by patience. A house that had once echoed with silence now echoed with lullabies. And in a corner of that home, I found peace too, not just for them, but for myself. Life settled into a rhythm, quiet but full. The house that once echoed with cold stares and unsaid words now held warmth, a softness that could only come from forgiveness. My uncle, once burdened by guilt, now wore a calm humility. He no longer tried to force closeness. He simply showed up, with gentle gestures, patient silence, and steady love. And my aunt, who had once shut the world out, began to let it in, one moment at a time. The baby changed everything. He wasn't just a child, he was a second chance. When he cried in the night, they woke together. When he giggled, it filled every corner of the home. Watching them care for him, the way their hands touched, the way their eyes met, I saw something I hadn't believed possible. They had become partners again, not because their past was erased, but because they had chosen to stop letting it control them. I often found myself watching from a distance. I had become a quiet observer of something beautiful blooming from soil that once felt barren. Sometimes, my aunt would glance at me while feeding her son and smile. Not the sad, tired smile she once wore, but a sincere one, layered with gratitude. "You saved me," she said once when we sat quietly after dinner. "If you hadn't come here, I might have gone down a path I'd never return from." I shook my head. "No, you saved yourself. I just listened." She smiled again, brushing her fingers over her child's head. "Still, thank you." I stayed, not because I had to, but because I wanted to. Over time, my job grew, and so did my sense of belonging. I wasn't just a guest in this house anymore, I was family. And when I finally moved out a year later, my aunt cried, not from sorrow, but from pride. Now, whenever I visit, the house is filled with laughter and life. My uncle plays with his son on the floor, my aunt hums softly in the kitchen, and the shadows that once haunted these walls have faded. This story is not just theirs, it's a story of what love can become when it stops trying to erase the past and instead builds something new from its ruins. Sometimes love arrives in twisted forms, flawed, even cruel. But real love, real healing begins when truth is spoken, when guilt is owned, and when forgiveness is not demanded but earned. And in this house, where love once left wounds, it now leaves light.